Hey everyone, my name is Josh and welcome back to your fourth stimulus package and news update. We have a lot of news to dive into in today's video, but first, if you would like to receive 5 free stocks from Webull valued up to $8,000, make sure to claim them by clicking my link, which you will find in the description box below. Okay, so we'll be starting off today's video with an update of Build Back Better. Once lawmakers return to Washington in January, the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has vowed to hold a floor vote on the bill. Even though Joe Manchin said he wasn't in favor of it, the vote will happen anyways and should fail with at least Manchin voting against it. After the bill fails, they'll be right back to the drawing board, attempting to get all 50 Democrats on board with another package. Perhaps they remove the measure which would extend the child tax credit and pass it that way. Or perhaps removing the measure would be too much to ask for progressive Democrats and they seek an alternative method. Lots to come on that front, with the negotiations taking place over the next several weeks. In addition to passing the Build Back Better, Senator Schumer will also look to pass pieces of legislation dealing with voting rights. In order for these bills to pass, they would need at least 60 votes in the Senate, meaning that at least 10 Republicans would need to get on board. This is something that's unlikely to happen, being that Republicans find these bills unnecessary. Democrats believe that requiring an ID to vote is racist, being that minorities may be less likely to hold an ID. Republicans say if you need an ID to purchase alcohol or cigarettes, then it shouldn't be too much to ask for an ID when you're at the voting booth. Here's Republican Senator Ted Cruz making his case why these voting rights bills are simply nonsense.
I want to start with a question for each of the 5 witnesses. In your judgment, are voter ID laws racist?
Thank you for that question. So it depends. One thing we have to stop doing is treating all voter ID laws as the same.
Okay, so your answer, I want to move quickly, so it depends is your answer?
Yes, that's my answer.
Okay, so what voter ID laws are racist?
Apologies, Mr. Cruz, your state of Texas, perhaps?
Okay, so you think the entire state of Texas is racist. What about requiring an ID to vote is racist?
So I think, sir, that's pretty reductive. I'm not saying the entire state of Texas is racist.
You just said my state of Texas, so you tell me, what about the Texas voter ID laws is racist?
So the fact that the voter ID law was put into place to diminish the political power of Latinos with racist intent and had been found to have
You're
racist
asserting
intent,
that. What's your evidence for that?
The federal district court that first resolved the constitutionality of Texas's voter ID law.
Okay, so your view is voter ID laws are racist. Mr. Van Spakovsky.
No, particularly because every single state that has passed an ID law has put in a provision to provide a free ID to anyone who doesn't have one. The turnout numbers show it has no effect, and I would remind everyone that the current version of the Texas voter ID law for in-person voting, the Obama administration agreed in court, in a court filing, that they were satisfied with it and that it was not discriminatory.
You know, I have to say this, the wildly partisan nature of the Democrats' proposal. The record should reflect all 3 of the Democratic witnesses invited by the chairman maintained to this committee that voter ID laws can be, in many instances, in most instances, I think of the various ways they formulated, are racist. So let me tell you who disagrees with that. 35 states across the country disagree with that because 35 states have voter ID laws in effect. But not just 35 states. 81% of voters in America disagree with the radical views proposed by the Democrats and the Democratic witnesses. Not just 81% of Americans. 77% of black voters in America support voter ID laws. 78% of Hispanic voters in America support voter ID laws. Maldev should think about that. 81% of low-income Americans support voter ID laws. And yet, what this bill is about is putting radicals in charge of saying if you require an ID to vote, that is racist and must be struck down. This is all about partisan power. Now, and I've got to say there is a view, particularly from Northeastern Democrats, that they look down on the rest of the country as a bunch of bigots and overalls, their Southern cousins who are too oafish to be as enlightened as they are. And I have to say there's an incredible hypocrisy in that states like Georgia and Mississippi have a higher black voter registration rate than states like Connecticut, the chairman's home state. They have higher black voter turnout rates than states like Connecticut. They have a lower gap between black and white turnout than in states like Senator Blumenthal's Connecticut. And in fact, states like Georgia and Mississippi, African Americans vote at a higher rate than white voters, and in Texas, they're basically equal. One of the sad realities of today's Democratic Party is they define race as follows. If you're a Democrat, you qualify. So under the Democratic view, I'm not Hispanic. Senator Padilla is. If you're a Democrat, you're an Hispanic. My abuelo and abuela would be very surprised to discover I wasn't Hispanic. But that's how Democrat views it. That's how the radicals in the civil rights division view it. And I will point out as an example, this committee, one new federal district judge in the state of Texas, Jason Pulliam, is an African-American judge nominated by President Trump, sat at this table, presented superbly. The Democrats had no criticism, and every single Democrat on this committee voted against him. Why? Because they perceived him as a black Republican. He didn't qualify as a black man. The Democrats were voting against Judge Pulliam. Do you have one basis to vote against him? Anything you disagree with? None of them had any single answer at all. This hearing's about one thing. It's about power, and it's about ensuring Democrats stay in power. That's cynical, and it's at the expense of democracy and the right of voters to express their will through free and fair elections.
As I mentioned, being that it's unlikely 10 Republicans will vote in favor of these voting right bills, Democrats will need to find another way to pass it. One way to do this would be to get rid of the filibuster, which would mean no longer needing 60 votes in the Senate in order to pass pieces of legislation such as this one. Once again though, both Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema are opposed to getting rid of the filibuster, so Democrats face yet another roadblock. President Biden recently said that he would be in favor of a filibuster carve-out if it meant the difference between voting rights laws passing or possibly not passing. Here's White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki saying just that.
Sure. Well, in case you all didn't see the interview the president did with ABC that aired last night, and more pieces were out this morning, the president was asked, and so everyone has the phrasing of what he said, so you support a carve out of the filibuster for voting rights. Well, I don't think we may have to go to that far, but I would. If it's the only thing standing between getting voting rights legislation passed and not getting passed is the filibuster, I support making the exception of voting rights for the filibuster. So just so everybody has the full context. The president has spoken to his strong view that getting voting rights legislation passed is a fundamental priority for him. It's something that is essential so that people across the country are able to exercise their right to vote, to participate in the democratic process. That's something he has always believed, always been committed to. As he said in his answer last night, we may not have to go to that, but he is prepared to support changes if that's the only thing standing in the way of getting this done.
Back in March, President Biden said it was his preference to not get rid of the filibuster.
The president's preference is not to get rid of the filibuster. Look at what we've been able to accomplish in the last 6 weeks. He's on the verge of passing a historic relief bill that's going to cut child poverty in half and create 7 million jobs. He's met with members on both sides of the aisle in the Oval, and he wants to continue to work on a bipartisan basis. And we believe there are opportunities to do exactly that.
In some other news, even though Democrats failed to pass Build Back Better before Christmas, they were able to pass a bipartisan piece of legislation designed to punish China for human rights abuses against ethnic and religious minorities in their country. This bill was signed into law yesterday by President Biden and will ban imports of goods from a region in China if they cannot be proven to be made without forced labor. Here is the White House press secretary responding to the signing of this bill.
Intel found itself in some hot water overnight over a statement it put out around supply chains in Xinjiang, and they're worried. And then they had to apologize to China and the Chinese people. Of course, the U.S. views what's happening in Xinjiang as a genocide, as you called it. How concerned are you that more American companies are going to find themselves sort of trapped in this situation, in particular with the signing of the Uyghur bill today by the president?
Well, I can't speak to the specific situation with one company, but I can say as a general matter that we believe the private sector and the international community should oppose the PRC's weaponizing of its markets to stifle support for human rights. We also think that American companies should never feel the need to apologize for standing up for fundamental human rights or opposing repression. As we've said before, We call on all industries to ensure that they are not sourcing products that involve forced labor, including forced labor from Xinjiang. The reality is that companies that fail to address forced labor and other human rights abuses in their supply chains face serious legal risk, reputational and customer risks, not just in the United States, but in Europe and other regions of the world. So that's broadly how we feel.
Can you just say briefly whether anyone in the administration spoke with any Chinese counterparts before the signing of this bill? Is there a concern that China will be upset by the president signing this bill? Was there any effort to smooth that over or not smooth it over?
We had announced our support or intention to sign the bill. I can certainly check if there was any diplomatic engagement around that, but that was, of course, prior to today. And certainly we have made no secret of our concerns. The president has spoken to them. We worked and gathered the G7 leaders to sign a statement on this about the human rights abuses in Xinjiang. So I don't know that it's a surprise.
Why did he sign it on camera?
He signs bills on camera, off camera, sometimes on camera. We support the bill, and obviously we've been leading the effort in the world to call out human rights abuses.
But on that note, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this video, and if you did make it all the way to the end, I definitely thank you for all of your support. And of course, if you did enjoy the content in today's video, I would also greatly appreciate it if you would give this video a big thumbs up, as that does definitely help out with the YouTube algorithm. And until next time, as always, I'll see you in the next video.